Hi everyone, and welcome to ConterLive, your sceptical guide to the Scottish election. My name's Kat Boyd, and I'll be your host this evening. Now, with just 2 weeks to go, ConterLive will be here every Wednesday, letting you talk to some of Scotland's biggest thinkers about the big issues that will shape our future on and after that big day on May 6th. Before I introduce our guests this evening, let me just take a second to say that we are entirely supported by word of mouth and your generosity. So please take a second, if you can, to help others find us by liking and subscribing to everything Independence Live and Conter. You can find us at conter.co.uk, and if you're feeling extra generous, please back independent media by giving us a small monthly donation. Now, this week has seen the launch of the party manifestos. Scotland's ruling party talks of free NHS dentistry, 4-day weeks, and further rollouts of free school meals. But some critics say it's too little too late, and others say the SNP promises are uncosted, particularly when there's no tax rises in the manifesto. So is Nicola Sturgeon banking on more spending sprees from Rishi Sunak? And just how secure are the SNP's manifesto commitments? The Conservatives, on the other hand, are talking about tax. They're talking about tax cuts for wealthier Scots. But, surprise, surprise, they spend most of their manifesto talking about the SNP. And the Greens promise a raft of spending. But will these promises last a coalition government? Also this week, we're talking about the European Union. The Alba Party made headlines by committing itself to EFTA rather than EU membership. But would an independent Scotland even get a say? Nicola Sturgeon says no, and the Greens have yet to clarify their position. Has the Holyrood establishment handed Scotland's sovereignty to Brussels before independence has even been sealed? And talking of Europe, football's Super League was launched this week and then promptly fell to pieces after resistance from players, politicians, and fans. Is monopoly capitalism finally reaching its limits? And finally, there has been major developments in America. The white police officer, Derek Chauvin, faces potentially decades in jail after being found guilty of murdering George Floyd. That murder led to a new awakening around issues of institutional racism. But will all of this generate any serious structural changes? Joining me to make sense of this and more are firstly Kevin McKenna, one of Scotland's leading no-nonsense journalists. Secondly, we have Catriona MacDonald, the SNP candidate for Edinburgh Southern. Next up, Adam Ramsay, an editor at OpenDemocracy and a member of the Scottish Green Party. Finally, we're joined with Jonathon Shafi, an independence activist, anti-racism campaigner, and critic of the SNP leadership. Now, welcome everyone, and let's just get started straight away. And I want to go straight into a discussion about our ruling party's latest manifesto for election. So Kevin, let me come to you. The SNP manifesto launched on Thursday and promises, transformations for the NHS, free dentistry, shorter working week. What are your thoughts on the manifesto? Is there anything in there that excites you at all? Anything radical? Can someone unmute Kevin, please?
There were quite a few nice looking little kind of Christmas tree trinkets, and I liked things like a desire, I don't know if you could call it a commitment to a 4-day week, the plan for 70% of new social housing in the next 10 or 11 years, significant investment in mental health. But then along with that, you've got things like free bikes, free dental health care. Now, who doesn't want free dental health care? but you know, free dental healthcare is only going to work if it's part of a suite of policies which are going to alleviate generations of deprivation in the usual housing estates. There was something about, and again, this sums up to me quite a lot of the managerialism in the SNP, to found a new national infrastructure company to manage public assets. What? That's just like a license to produce 50 or 60 more bureaucrats. £50 million to as a prize for economic transformation, a 10-year plan for economic transformation. I can tell you right now who's going to be in the shortlist for that. I can tell you right now, and it won't be 50 million quid. You know, put in the agency bonus, put in kind of if it gets delivered a couple of years early, put in all the subcontracting. Housing, again, it's easy to say that these things haven't been properly costed, but we know over the next few years with the recovery from the pandemic that the economic conditions are going to be worse than usual. The SNP doesn't have a great record at delivering things like social housing. So although I love the idea, but the fact is that like in 2019, we were running at annual housing shortages of 7,000. We've got 400,000 more people living in Scotland now than 20 years ago. So it's not that I don't like the commitment or the partial commitment. I just simply don't think they're capable because they've had 14 years to look at social housing in the usual communities that 14, 15 years ago were coming top of the usual depressing indexes, and in 14 years of unbroken SNP rule, the same communities are there. So yeah, call me a little bit cynical, but there's no detail, there's no kind of plan to break the links of or the patterns of multi-deprivation which have happened over 20 years, 14 years of them within the SNP. But they don't have to be radical, Kat, because when you've got a hard right UK government headed by Boris Johnson, when you've got Brexit getting blamed for everything, and when you've got the COVID, you don't have to be radical, because I can tell you right here and now, if any of these pledges are broken or aren't even started, those three factors, you'll be hearing an awful lot of them. They will all be voted ad nauseam.
Well, you mentioned COVID, or called it the COVID. I mean, that obviously gets a big mention at the start of the SNP's manifesto, but it's also going to dictate the timeline for the next referendum, which is a promise in the manifesto. But, you know, in the last 6 months, I think you've made this point in some of your articles, we've had Ian Blackford saying 2021, this year. We've had Nicola Sturgeon saying next term. Then the latter half of the next term of Parliament, and now in the manifesto is after the COVID crisis is done. What do you make of this commitment to an independence referendum after the COVID crisis? You need to.
You got me?
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, I think they're having a laugh. Who gets to decide when the COVID's over? You know, are they going to hire Cambridge Analytics to come up with a set of algorithms that will tell us, right, officially the pandemic's over, we can do X, Y, and Z, and we can have a referendum? I mean, this will be, I'll tell you how this is going to play out. At some point, at various points, when we think the pandemic's over, when there's zero deaths, when everybody's vaccinated, there'll be a variant. We haven't found a cure for the flu. I think it's a catch-all that will allow the SNP off the hook for any firm commitment and concomitantly able just to keep the wider independence movement on the tee. I've heard it all before. There's been 4 separate dates. Blackford's come up with 2. Sorry, Sturgeon's come up with 2. Blackford's come up with 1. And then you Keith Brown saying, when the COVID's over. When's that going to happen, Keith? You know, have you got scientific knowledge? Do you trust everything? You're going to have about half a dozen different people saying, well, actually it's over now because of such and such. Yeah, but what about the variant? And I've heard about something coming from South Korea. It's a catch-all. We've been here before. Nothing firm, nothing radical. Path of least resistance, no risk.
Well, let me bring you on this then. So, Catriona, I suppose that one of the big questions for the SNP in this manifesto, where there are some radical policies around it, the shorter working week, is why now? You know, the SNP have been in power for quite a long time, and you know, some people would say there's been more national scandals than notable policy proposals. What's the difference going to be this time?
Well, this is a manifesto for Scotland's recovery from COVID. This is a manifesto that's intended to prepare us for becoming an independent nation. And I think one of the things that's different now is that within the SNP, we've got new movements pushing for these kind of progressive green policies. So, for example, I'm a member of the SNP's Common Weal Group. And since we were founded last year, we've been working really, really hard to get progressive green policies like some of those you've mentioned, like a national care service as well, like nationalised public rail services and reform of tenants' rights onto the SNP agenda. So part of this manifesto is a testament to the work that members across Scotland have been doing to get these ideas into the SNP's agenda and onto the SNP's manifesto. And I think that there's an appetite for that now, because people have seen over the last year why it's so important that we have things like resilient public institutions, like a national care service or an NHS that's able to cope with public health crises like the pandemic that we've just had. So although the SNP have been in government for a long time and we've made a lot of progress within the limits of the devolution settlement, this is the kind of manifesto that I would like to see as we're moving towards independence, and we want to see a referendum in this parliamentary term. You know, this is the time for Scotland to decide to take the full powers of independence and get on with this.
Well, you mentioned the SNP Commonweal Group and new movements inside the party. I mean, my understanding was that large swathes of the SNP Commonweal Group have actually defected from the party and joined ALBA. And I know that the SNP has always been a bit of a broad church spanning left and right, and you are on the left of the party. But is the left of the SNP still viable despite the exodus to ALBA? I mean, who have attracted a huge swathe of people who were involved in the SNP Commonweal Group?
Well, it wasn't a huge swathe. I mean, we lost a couple of members, but I wouldn't say that we lost more than any other part of the SNP. I don't think ALBA is a left-wing movement that solely took members from the left of the SNP. Although I do think, having seen ALBA's manifesto, you can see some similar policies that we were pushing for there. And so it looks as if a similar movement to us has cropped up within the ALBA party, which, you know, I think is only a positive thing. If we're getting left-wing ideas into other political parties, then that's a good thing. I think those of us that have remained in the SNP, those of us that are committed to the SNP and to independence, are still working in the way that we have been for the last year to promote discussion, to promote the grassroots getting involved in shaping party policy. And this is just the first manifesto that we've contributed to, and we will have opportunities to do so in the future. And also to make sure that what is in this manifesto is actually translated into action.
I mean, I think that I would agree with you. You know, ALBA's not just a left-wing party that took chunks of the SNP left. It's also a broad church. I think the concern is for a lot of SNP supporters is, how does the left of the SNP hold the government, hold the centre and leadership of the party to account on some of these things? And I just want to come to Jonathon Shafi on this, because you've been a critic of Nicola Sturgeon's so-called progressive credentials. Do you think that there's anything for socialists outside the SNP to like in the manifesto?
Well, in some senses, over the last, let's say, year during the pandemic, there has been a lot of discussion about presentational issues, how information is communicated to the general public. But what there hasn't been is a real and deeply felt discussion about where the economy is going and the impact that the pandemic has had on ordinary people's lives. Youth unemployment, for example, has jumped by over 50%. We are going into a period now economically, which is going to press down on people after already being pressed down after a decade of austerity. So the kind of turbulence that people are going to experience in their daily lives isn't going to end when the restriction ends. In fact, when the furlough does come to an end, we're going to move into a new phase of the consequences of the pandemic. And so with that context, you look at the SNP manifesto, and it's true that there are a number of policies which I would support and all the rest of it, but I don't believe that they are, it's not whether a question of whether they're going to be implemented or not. I don't believe that their approach is going to fundamentally alter the economic situation for working class people up and down the country. It's not to say that some of these policies won't have some impact, but in terms of the renewal and the transformation that's needed, it doesn't touch the surface. So one thing that's missing and glaringly missing from the manifesto, in my opinion, is there's no semblance of a coherent industrial strategy. And if you're going into a period that's measured by unemployment, by deepening levels of poverty, by the fact that there's a huge reserve army of labour, meaning that conditions can be cut even if you look at the claim that they're going to offer young people opportunities. Lots of these opportunities are going to be unpaid. So there's a huge crisis building up here. And my opinion is that when that crisis does build up, as it is already doing, the SNP manifesto as it currently stands just won't be anywhere near what is necessary to get us through this next period. And just lastly, since it's been touched on already, because it links to the industrial strategy and the question of how you're building the economy, the SNP government has sold off all of Scotland's green and renewable assets to global investors. Those are our natural resources. Those are our key infrastructure that should be held in common hands. Its wealth used and distributed for the people of Scotland. And what better way to start an industrial strategy than through that kind of process? But they've sold it all off to global investors, and it's £3 billion worth that's been sold off. But that's not that pales in comparison to what money could be made and how it could be reinvested. And that, of course, links to their currency question. I just want to say, just to conclude in terms of this answer, when they talk about once the COVID crisis is passed, they're not just talking about, in my opinion, they're not just talking about restrictions and the pandemic when it comes to COVID, the virus. I think they're also talking about the economic consequences, because their prospectus is such that we wouldn't have a central bank to intervene into the economy, to build the economy. You'd have sterlingization, and you'd have it for a minimum of 10 years. And Kate Forbes was on TV the other day. She says 6 tests would have to be met before we get our own currency, before we get our own central bank. Well, those 6 tests are designed not to be met in the first place because they were designed by the corporate lobby. So big questions are coming up, in my opinion, for the SNP leadership.
I think they are, and Catriona, I don't think it's your job here to defend the entire party. I know that you're coming from a particular position, but I did see you react to some of what Jonathon was saying there, and I just wanted to see, do you want to respond to some of that?
Well, just on the currency question, it's not SNP policy to have sterlingization for 10 years or for an indefinite period. SNP policy is that we will transition to an independent currency as soon as is practically possible. And by that, we mean as soon as we've established the necessary financial institutions to allow us to launch a stable and successful new currency. Of course, we need a new currency, an independent currency, in order to have the full financial powers to become a successful independent country. And work to establish the financial institutions that will make that happen has already begun. The Scottish National Investment Bank is one example. But what we have to do is we have to take this opportunity to shape that process and to use these new institutions to reframe Scotland's economy around principles like ending poverty, tackling the climate crisis, and protecting public institutions instead of centering them on private profit.
Thanks, Catriona. Now, Adam, I want to just bring you in on the Greens manifesto, and I know you're not standing as a candidate, but I wanted to ask you about one of the proposals in it. Now, the Green Party's manifesto, and there's been lots of talk about a Green coalition government with the SNP. The manifesto that the Scottish Greens launched calls for a public inquiry into the Scottish Government handling of the pandemic, and that's something I believe the SNP are supportive of. But do you think that the Greens have done enough in the last term of government to actually hold the SNP to account on some of their domestic failures?
Do I think? I mean, probably not in some cases. I'm not here to defend the Greens particularly. That's a big question, and it's quite a loaded one in a sense, isn't it? I mean, obviously, there's the Greens could have done a better job in some cases over the last 5 years on some issues, and on the other hand, there's 6 MSPs who have a limited amount of time and resource, and if they have more, they'll do more. The thing I think that is the problem both in the SNP and sometimes in the Greens is the fear of conflict. There's a kind of a liberal hue to both parties, and this is more true of the SNP than the Greens, who think that you can just do nice things for everyone, rather than understanding that politics is about the negotiation of interests between different classes in society. And if you're going to do nice things for one group of people, that probably means taking stuff off other people, and taking stuff off rich people particularly. And that that in the internal politics of the Greens, it's definitely the case that there are those who are happier talking about kind of conflict in general, and that means conflict with the SNP sometimes, and also conflict on what I'd see as serious class politics. And those who like the SNP like to think you can kind of just do nice things for everyone, and happy to stop there. And I think that in a sense you see the same with the SNP manifesto. That what they've done over their time in government and what they're proposing to do again is a set of the nice things that you can do without picking a fight with anyone with real power. And the problem is that that's quite a limited amount of stuff you can do. We just had a baby, we got a baby box, that's lovely, and it's great, and I'm all in favour. But it doesn't involve, picking significant fights with millionaires and billionaires in order to seriously redistribute their wealth. And, I think that the SNP have a real weakness in their inability to, understand the necessity of conflict in that. And it's true that the Greens are also inflected with some of that politics.
I think one of the weaknesses in the SNP's manifesto is on the question of the European Union. I know that the Greens have that view on the European Union, which is, some would argue, quite a rosy view on the possibilities for change in the existing European Union. But what's not specified in the Greens manifesto is the process by which an independent Scotland would determine its relationship with the European Union. Nicola Sturgeon has ruled out a second referendum on EU membership after independence. But I wanted to know, what's the Greens' position on this?
I don't know. And as you say, it's not the manifesto, and I'm not I'm not here to speak for the Greens. I think that what is the case is that the first set of questions after the question of independence are big and meaty questions. We talked about currency already. There's a major question about global positioning, and absolutely the EU is the most prominent one. But you look at the debate in Greenland at the moment, for example, about what independence there would look like. Because Greenland is legally part of Denmark still, and it's about their negotiation between China and the US and Europe, and where they sit in that space. And I think that we're going to have some really serious conversations, do some real thinking about what we mean by independence in a globalized world. And we had some of that conversation before the last referendum, but we need to really think our way into that space, particularly before, but also after the next referendum. And I'm in favour of EU membership, but I think that's only the very beginning of the conversation about foreign policy and how you relate to the world.
Well, Kevin, I want to come back to you on this matter of the European Union, because you voted Remain, but you have been quite critical of the SNP's Europhile positioning. What sort of relationship should an independent Scotland have to the European Union?
I think whatever relationship we have has to start with a referendum. I find it depressing that Nicola Sturgeon doesn't want one. I know why she doesn't, because if there is a referendum, then there will be scrutiny, and there will be hopefully a mature discussion of what the European Union is, what it represents, what its chief motivating factors are. And Nicola Sturgeon doesn't want that, because the more you look at the EU, what motivates it, the way that it uses muscle economics to secure favourable deals for the richest nations on earth, the way that it economically bullies those that they feel have failed, the way that they use procurement laws to allow the free passage of multinational global firms across borders, undercut local pay deals, exploit foreign labour. She doesn't want any of that. I feel that the EU referendum debate from 2016 in the UK drove the nature of it, the nasty nature of it, drove quite a few people who were holding their nose about the EU, who had issues with the EU, into remaining, because there was a lot of, as we know, xenophobia, which tipped out into outright racism. I know a lot of people, probably myself included, who, when it came down to it, the chief deciding factor was, do you want to be in the same side as some of these gargoyles? And the answer was no. But on the other hand, there was also a kind of haughty disdain by the political liberal elites, who were quite happy to label the Northeast English people, Northwest English people, and traditional working class communities, which had been represented by Labour for generations, as kind of knuckle draggers and racists. And I visited a lot of these places in the run-up, and they utterly resented the way that they had been labelled by the political classes. Not just Labour. Quite a lot of people in Scotland were saying this as well. Look at them; they're ignorant. And I didn't think that they were racist, but what they felt was that they had been let down by a lot of those who were purporting to represent them, by just, as you mentioned the phrase, ceding sovereignty to Europe without any question, without any consultation. So maybe there is a relationship, maybe there is, I don't know, but I want a debate on it. And I want it to be an honest and a mature debate, and I want scrutiny of what that organisation is, essentially. But I don't think Nicola Sturgeon wants that.
Adam, because we've had a comment from a viewer saying the EU's got more crooks than Westminster in it. And I think that there's a lot of people who would have, watched the EU's record of support for small nations like Greece or Catalonia, and be really, really sceptical about rejoining. So what's your thoughts on this?
Well, there's a few things I'd like to say. I mean, the first is, of course, Kevin's right, that the EU is, it's a kind of playground for former imperial centres to kind of go through the process of grieving the loss of their empires. And as a result, it's got some fairly grim politics globally, but it also, you look at what you get outside the EU, and you similarly have some of the same dynamics playing out. And I think that, the question over the next decade in the EU is going to be how it changes itself. And that will be decided very much in two elections over the next year, in September in Germany, and in April next year in the French presidential election. And I think that, how we relate to the EU in many ways depends on what's going on in the EU at the time. And we don't really know post-pandemic how that's going to shift. But I think that more fundamentally, for those of us in Scotland, these are a set of questions about how we're going to make decisions quite quickly after an independence vote, if there is one. And, I absolutely am in favour of more radical, more direct democracy, more referendums, and also other ways of making decisions as a country. And I think that it's going to be important for the left of the independence movement to make the case from now that, that as well as a long-term process to get a Scottish constitution that's much, much more democratic than Westminster's, and doesn't kind of assume all the cultural artifacts of the kind of absurd Westminster system, we're also going to need a fairly rapid kind of interim constitution to think about how we're going to make all these interim decisions and make sure that isn't just handed over to Goldman Sachs and PwC, but is in fact made by the people of Scotland in a series of democratic processes. And these are conversations we need to be having now.
So, Adam, just to be clear, is it your view that an independent Scotland should join the European Union automatically, or do you think that a new vote is required for that type of action?
Well, look, I think that an independent Scotland should, from through the process of getting independence, even before it officially happens, have a much more radically democratic set of ways of making decisions than we currently are used to. I don't think that the sort of Westminster binary model of democracy, which is once in a while you have a big referendum and that's about it, and otherwise you just get to vote in an election every 5 years, is particularly functional. So, do I think these things should be automatic? No, I would like to see a series of fairly direct democratic decisions about all these questions, including currency, including the EU, and so on. And to be honest, I don't know exactly what that would look like. I think we need to think quite hard about how we'd shape those processes.
Thanks, Adam. Now, Catriona, I know that you've been endorsed by Yes for EU, and that a lot of your campaign in Edinburgh Southern has focused on, Brexit and the issues that you've presented around Brexit in your campaign materials. But some people, I think, are concerned that there's a commitment in the SNP to the European Union, which is almost greater than its commitment to Scottish sovereignty. Do you think that there's a danger the SNP would want to join the EU, even if it meant a hard border with England, by far our biggest trading partner?
Well, so yeah, I'm standing in Edinburgh Southern, which was one of the strongest Remain voting areas in Scotland in 2016, and we have a huge number of people living here who are either EU citizens themselves or have EU citizens who are family members, and we also have a lot of people working in sectors like education that are very, very, very concerned about the impacts of Brexit. So that's why it's been a big part of the campaign, because locally it's a really big concern for people. I think an independent Scotland should join the EU. I think that would be most beneficial to us, and because it would mean that we would have a seat at the table to set the regional agenda. I mean, the EU is on our doorstep, so we're within its trade agenda, whether we like it or not, and whatever our relationship with the EU looks like, whether it's EFTA, whether it's EEA, whether it's membership, we will be part of the EU's agenda. And I think that the best way for us to shape that agenda is to be a part of the EU. The EU is guided by its member governments, and a lot of what we've seen in the EU in the last few years, in the last decade or so, that we don't like has been a result of a wider surge of kind of right-wing nationalist movements across Europe, and I think that we could have a role in changing that. Now, to answer your question about a hard border with England, we do not want a hard border with England because of the impact that would have on people in Scotland and people in England. It's in nobody's interests for that to happen. And we have the potential to be part of the EU, to obviously meet the criteria that the EU requires for us to do so. And then in sectors where we have a particularly close relationship with England, like the services sector, for example, there's the potential for us to negotiate a relationship with England that is mutually beneficial. And it won't be like the negotiations around Brexit, because unlike the UK in Brexit, we are not seeking to create a hard border with England. We're not seeking to prevent people moving between Scotland and the rest of the UK. That was a big issue in the Brexit negotiations, was that the UK said freedom of movement must end. We don't have that kind of damaging red line that would influence those negotiations. So no, we don't want a hard border with England, and it's not necessary for us to choose between England and the EU.
Do you think that there's any advantages of being outside the EU's rules? I'm thinking specifically of the SNP citing European Union rules in the refusal to support the green infrastructure deal with BIFAB. So are there not actually some advantages for an independent Scotland in actually being outside of the EU and perhaps in another arrangement?
Well, this is exactly the kind of discussion that we need to have once probably not once we become independent, but while we're becoming independent, because of course there are benefits to the different kinds of relationships that we could have with the EU. It's obviously the SNP position, and it's my belief that full membership of the EU gives us the right balance between having a say on what these rules are and being party to the rules. I think that yes, you could argue that being outside of some of the EU rules is beneficial, but then obviously the flip side of that is we don't get to influence those rules.
Jonathan, I'm going to bring you in here because you've been a really staunch critic of the European project. Why do you think so many people, favour being in the European Union? Catriona's talked about her constituency in Edinburgh Southern, in one of the Remain strongholds. And why is it that you take a different position?
Well, I think there's a few points here. I mean, first of all, Scotland will not be joining the EU to shape the policy of the EU. It will be the other way around. Scotland will be joining on its knees and will be at the behest of Brussels, and not the democratically elected Parliament, so-called, but the unelected European Commission, who, by the way, have just set up another commission to handle immigration and called it the Committee to Defend European Values. A direct mirror image of the far right across the EU. So the rose-tinted view of the European Union just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. I mean, recently in the European Parliament, they voted in a manner that would potentially put the Catalan president or the ex-Catalan president, Charles Puigdemont, in jail. They've not stood by the people of Catalonia when it comes to self-determination, but that shouldn't surprise us. They stand against every single democratic initiative that emerges in the European Union, whether that be through social mobilisations or whether it be through referenda, because if they don't like the result, they throw another referendum onto the population again, like they did in Ireland. Now, before we get to the question of should there be a referendum in an independent Scotland on the European Union, let's remember that the SNP supported, and I think this is a huge strategic error, they supported a confirmatory vote on the Brexit deal. Now, that opens us up to a confirmatory vote on any deal around independence. Not only that, to me, there's a double democratic deficit by not allowing a referendum on the EU, and I'll say why. First of all, if you've set up a new independent country, then the nature of the debate, the context and the framework of the discussion is completely different to that of 2016. 2016 is a distant memory when you compare it to that situation. And I'm not sure you wouldn't find, when you look at what you'd have to sign up to become a member of the European Union, a majority of people in Scotland potentially being won to the idea that actually we don't want to become a member of the European club. So it has to be a debate, and you have to be involved in the debate. And actually the debate should run throughout the whole of the referendum, because I agree with Adam when he talks about what is the nature of sovereignty. That's part of the debate we need to have, and the European Union is very clearly part of that. And the second issue is what I referred to at the start. When you become a member of the European Union, you're then at the behest of a whole series of what I would argue, a straitjacket when it comes to your economy and how you want to reorientate it. Now look, just the last couple of points about this. The European Union is not some stable, permanent organisation. It's always going through one crisis or another. You could talk about Catalonia, you could talk about the banking crisis in the Eurozone, you could talk about the way Greece was handled as well. And it's going now into new forms of both economic and social crises. We could have a far-right leader in France come to power. And so when people have framed Brexit as we are some rainy fascist island and the continent's some totally different space, it's not. The questions are actually very similar. But for us, I think we have to be arguing for a sense of having solidarity between the peoples of Europe rather than the states of Europe. And they're two very different things. The last thing I'll just say about this, it comes back to the question of sovereignty. What have we got here? Catriona, you answered the question about the 6 tests and currency far better than Kate Forbes, and I'd rather that you were in her position, to be honest. But she did, as Finance Secretary, talk about the 6 tests, whether or not it was policy or not, right? And the reality is you cannot join the European Union without your own central bank. So the SNP's policy as it currently stands literally doesn't make sense. They're arguing independence in Europe without a referendum, but they're also at the same time arguing sterlinisation tied to tests that takes at least a decade to get a central bank. So the whole prospectus here being put by the SNP doesn't actually add up. And it's about time it was exposed. in my opinion, and for a very important reason, that if there is a referendum, we actually want to win it. And if we win it, we actually want to change Scotland. The way it's looking just now, even if you win a referendum, it's going to be subject to NATO making the foreign policy decisions. And by the way, that includes problems around Trident, the EU making the decisions around what public services are privatised, and the City of London and UK financial institutions having the Scottish economy at its whim and extracting wealth from the economy rather than building the kind of society that we want to see via independence. And independence, if it's to mean anything, has to be about the ability of people in Scotland to make the decisions about all of these things.
I mean, I think that's a very impassioned point that you're making. You've got some claps in the comments there. But let me ask you the big question then, because you do support Scottish independence, but would you be willing to join the EU if that was the cost of winning the case for independence?
Look, you can, in all of these things, as in politics and life, you can't choose the conditions in which you operate. But what I would be doing is throughout the process is making the arguments about what the reality of the EU would be. One thing you can't do is lie to people. You have to be honest and you have to be upfront. And I'm not going to be organising campaigns going around communities around where I live in Glasgow, for example, and not being upfront with people about what sterilisation, the Growth Commission or EU membership might entail. So it's got to be part of the discussion. But really, to get to that point, we're going to need to build a movement. And I think that movement is going to have to be outside of the Parliament, and it's going to have to put pressure on the political parties in Holyrood. And by the way, I'll just say that everything that I've just said in terms of the contradictions in the SNP case, let me tell you this, the unionists are keeping their powder dry on this. They're not making these arguments just now, but they will. And the arguments that they will make are going to dismantle the present case so easily that I don't even think we would necessarily win a referendum under those conditions.
Thanks, Jonathan. Adam.
Sure. I mean, I think, just to kind of semi-stick up for the EU, and I should say, in February last year, I was detained at the EU's border wall in Ukraine by 5 armed guards. So, when Shafi says that, there's this kind of, gold-plated view we get presented by a lot of, the same people who criticise Trump's border wall don't ever talk about the fact that the EU has an equivalent right across the east of Europe. And I can tell you it's a grim place. But basically, the choice with Brexit was a choice between two different sets of regulations about trade and how we operate in the market. It was either the current EU regulated space or effectively the North American regulated space. And that's what Brexiters in England wanted and still want us to join. So, to respond to Catriona, I do want a customs border, at least with England, if England is going to be part of the North American regulated space, or rather deregulated space, because I don't want my daughter being fed poisonous food, which is what they're going to want to allow. And a lot of the point of Brexit for American capital was to get access to the UK market, and that means selling dangerous products to us. And so, absolutely, I want a customs border with England if we have independence. And if I have to choose between those two regulated spaces, the European one, which is semi-regulated, not as much as I'd like, but there's some, protection of consumer rights and workers' rights, etc., or the American deregulated space, then absolutely I will choose the European regulated space. Now, you can make a case for being outside both and attempting a kind of model of socialism within one country, and that's a serious case to make. I'm not, I don't mean that frivolously. I would love to see a case made by serious people on the Scottish left, looking at what it means to be a socialist or even social democratic country in the current globalized world. But I've not yet seen any serious discussion. I've not seen anyone seriously talk about how you resist the pressure of global capital in that context. I've not seen people talk about, what it means to be bought up by China and asset stripped by China in that context. And, when, as Shafi described, over the last decade, we've seen so much of the UK and therefore Scottish economy brought up by, shifting from essentially corporate power to offshore oligarch power. We've seen the mass asset stripping of our economy. And I've not seen any serious case for what it looks like to try and build a socialism in one country in that context. Now, absolutely, those of you who are against rejoining the EU are welcome to make that case, and I might vote for it, but I've not seen that case yet.
Thanks, Thanks, Adam. Now, Kevin, do you want to come in on any of these comments that have been made? Would you be willing to join the European Union if that was the cost of winning the case for independence, or would that just not be worth it?
Yeah, sort of. Yeah, but I think, as Jonathan was saying, what sort of independent Scotland? What do we mean by independence? When we're going to have three massive outside authorities who are going to basically effectively parcel up and look after the jurisdiction in these. So then it becomes a different question, doesn't it? If we're an independent Scotland and we don't join the EU, then how independent are we anyway? I've become quite depressed over the last 5 years with the complete absence of any commitment to improving the lives of our most disadvantaged communities, of whom there are hundreds of thousands with vast economic potential, and the SNP path of least resistance. So yeah, I suppose so. I'm still taking my chances with independence, but I am depressed at the nature of the debate within the SNP, and I utterly question its commitment to independence.
Thanks, Kev. Now, Catriona, last word to you. Can you snap Kevin McKenna out of his depression? Any last thoughts?
Well, I think it's the SNP are here to deliver independence, and we will deliver independence. But what we need is, and Jonathan touched on this, and Jonathan says this all the time, we need a mass movement for independence that is centred on ending poverty and showing people that independence is not just a political thing that gets trotted out by a couple of parties every time there's an election. It is a real movement for material change to people's lives. And I think it's really great that we're having these kind of discussions now about what our relationship with the EU might look like, what our economy might look like. We have an opportunity now to present to people an economic case for independence, which is centred on those principles that we share. And I think it's so important that we do, as Adam also touched on, think about what kind of a democracy we want an independent Scotland to be, and how all of us can, with shared values about how we want our country to be run, can participate in that and ensure that whatever happens, the choice is in Scotland's hands, not in Westminster's.
Thank you so much, Catriona, for that, and thanks to all our guests. We're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us today. You can join us every week at the same time up until the election, with a whole range of guests being asked these sorts of questions that just aren't asked on the mainstream media. I'd like to take this opportunity just before we close to thank Independence Live for all of their technical support and for hosting the show. Without them, this would not have been possible. You can keep up to date with the show and many more events by subscribing to their YouTube channel or checking out their website, independencelive.net. In addition to this, we'd like to thank our guests for being part of the discussion today. If you'd like to keep up to date with what our guests are doing during the election, then you can follow them on social media. You can follow Catriona's campaign on Twitter at Catriona SNP. You can follow Kevin at KMcKenna63 and keep an eye out for his articles in the Herald and the National. Jonathan's always got streams of latest thoughts on Twitter. You can follow him at Jonathon_Shafi, and Adam Ramsay's thoughts can be found on Twitter at Adam Ramsay. Finally, thank you to Conter for organising this event. Remember, Conter brings you the best guests and insights. We aren't funded by millionaires, and if you can afford it, please think about supporting Conter with a monthly donation. You can do that and a lot more at our website, conter.co.uk. Thank you all and good night. Until next week.